Okay, it's 10:15, so I'll start. Welcome everyone back to the second day of Kerry James Marshall Conversations. Thank you once again yesterday to all the people who presented. Outstanding presentations yesterday, and I'm sure it will be the same today. I have 15 minutes to fill, which I wasn't kind of expecting to do, but there's a few things that I'd like to point out, kind of different things. The first is that if you are here in London and at the Royal Academy in the next day or two, you've also got the opportunity to see an amazing show that's curated by Tarini Malik. Tarini's a curator who's the curator of contemporary art at the Royal Academy. She recently worked with John Akomfra and curated the British Pavilion at the last Venice Biennial with John. And she's given me a few notes just to sort of read out about her show. So it's called A Story of South Asian Art, Mrinali Mukherjee and Her Circle, and it's in the Sackler wing of galleries. By the way, it's the good Sacklers. It's a complex family, and I swear to God that the Royal Academy, everyone in Britain took the other Sackler people off the name of their buildings, but there is part of the family that was never connected, which is why it's in the Sackler wing. Right, it's the show traces almost a century of art across almost every medium, from monumental textile sculptures, ceramics, and paintings. It brings together artists who worked in close dialogue with Mrinali Mukherjee, the late Indian artist. And it's been built around her because she sits at a fascinating crossroads between modernism and the contemporary, between the intimate and the monumental, between the art school and the studio, between inherited traditions and experimental futures. And her practice was never in isolation, as art never is. And the show is a celebration of relationships, friendships, and the familial. And I really do invite you to go and see it while you're here. And talking about friendships, I also wanted to point out another show that's a 5-minute walk away, which is Arthur Jafer's show at Sadie Cole's HQ on Kingly Street. You could even see that during your lunch break. It's been fascinating for me to chart the long dialogue of Arthur Jafer and Kerry James Marshall. It began in 1985 when Kerry did his first ever published interview in an LA weekly, now discontinued newspaper. Arthur Jafer read it, called up Kerry, and they started being friends. That led to an invitation for Kerry to be the production designer on Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust, and we're going to hear about that more later. But their dialogue continued. There's a very interesting exchange of letters, an interview they did for Kerry's first published book, a monograph published by Abrams. It's a fascinating interview from the year 2000, and they've continued to be close friends, and Arthur Jafer was here at the opening of both the histories and also the show at the Tabernacle that looks at Kerry James Marshall's Rhythm Master project. So it's really great that this show is here in London. As I said, it's a 5-minute walk away. Sadie Cole's HQ, Kingly Street, and you'll see 2 newish films and a number of new print works and paintings and sort of sculptures. A really great exhibition. He also opens this week a show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, curated by him. It's a sort of artist choice show. Before introducing today's speakers, I thought I just might say a couple of words about the structure of the histories, how the show came about, since I might as well, because I wasn't planning anything else to say right now. The exhibition was I first talked to Kerry about doing a large exhibition in London in 2017 after doing an acquisition for the Tate. And initially the show was conceived of as taking place in the Herzog and de Meuron building of Tate Modern. When I left the Tate, I approached the Royal Academy to say, would you be interested in an exhibition of Kerry James Marshall? And they said yes. And it was only at that point that the structure of the show was conceived. And I started by thinking about the architecture of the Royal Academy and the sort of history of what it means that it's an academy. The architecture is these grand rooms, which would look pretty bad if you try and put a wall in the middle of them, and look best with paintings in them. And so the first decision was to sort of respect the grandeur of the architecture. The next decision was that there's two ways of entering the show. You can go in through an octagonal gallery that's called Central Hall, or you can go in the entrance where you go in. The octagonal gallery has 4 large walls, and yesterday we looked quite often at the series of works called Souvenirs, which are these sort of angels remembering the 1960s. And I wanted to bring the 4 souvenir paintings together, and I made the decision that they would look great in this octagonal room, but you couldn't enter onto that space because that's not where the show should begin. So that meant that you couldn't, that they were going to go in that room, and then we'd enter in another room. And that means that you sort of come in a medium-sized room, go into another medium-sized room, and then enter the first very grand room. There are 3 very grand rooms and 8 medium rooms, which are also kind of grand. And respecting the idea that each room has a sort of, it feels very distinct, I thought to organize the exhibition through cycles of works rather than as a strict chronology. In some cases, you'll see a complete cycle, like the all 4 souvenirs, or all 5 of the early works from 1991 to 1994 that deal with Middle Passage and African retentions and spiritual practices, or the 8 new paintings that constitute a series that we'll talk about later today. In other cases, a single room gathers together works that are kind of thematically linked. There's a room called Pantheon, which concentrates on many of the portraits, like imagined portraits of key figures from Black American history, like Harriet Tubman, David Walker, Nat Turner. So there was this decision, to have 11 cycles, 11 rooms, and then to begin with a room around the academy. But the Royal Academy, you may know this, you may not, has a functioning postgraduate course. It's a free course. It's 3 years. And if you've walked through the space, you might see that there are casts. People often draw sketches of those casts. There are life drawing classes. There's also kind of much less traditional art education things going on here. But thinking about the Royal Academy as a space of art education as well as display and exhibition making, I thought it would be interesting to start the show with 5 works that sort of really connect to that idea of the Academy. One is called the Academy, and we looked at it yesterday. Then there's the studio from the Metropolitan Museum, the 2 imagined self-portraits, and then the underpainting. And underpainting is this historical method taught in academies where you'd lay down the tones of your painting before adding colour. So that was the reason to begin like that. The exhibition goes to Zurich and then to Paris, and Kelly Christina Grant is here, and Emma Nordberg is here as well. So we're working all together with Fabrice Hergot in Paris. And it's going to be really exciting for the show to be in a completely different architecture. And actually, we're talking about different things potentially to do in Paris, and to hopefully include some works that connect to Kerry's interest in negritude. There's a series of collages that were inspired by Aimé Césaire, and I'm trying to see if we can bring them into the checklist for Paris. But it's going to be just a different sequencing of the works because of a different architecture. The 4 wall colours that I chose for this space are basically taken from the National Gallery, the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. I wanted to convey the idea of grandeur, where you see Titian paintings, for instance, or Holbein paintings that Kerry loves and quotes. In the National Gallery, you often see them against these purple or dark blue, green walls. The grey is the grey from the new wing of the National Gallery that has Van Eyck in it, another painter that he quotes in some of his works. So that hopefully gives you a sort of background. Other things to say is that we commissioned, there's a great catalogue. Kerry always wanted to be in dialogue with Benjamin Bouclot. I mentioned Bouclot kind of in passing yesterday where I showed the slide of the book called Art Since 1900. As I mentioned, the critics associated with that book, the October School, are the critics that he's always read. He's always said that those are the critics he took most seriously because he thought the level of their discourse about contemporary art was higher than any other group of thinkers about art. But they never looked at his work. You know, that entire book has not one image of a work by him. And no, it has no images of figurative paintings that aren't based on photographs after Andy Warhol and Gerhard Richter. So he always read their work but felt that they weren't in any way interested in his work. More recently, they have become. Hal Foster wrote an essay on him, and Benjamin Bouclot has this amazing, or very, very interesting interview with him that begins the catalogue. Then I have a long essay that traces sort of 7 sections of his work, 7 connected to that number 7 that he brings into some of his works. Then we have Nikita, who's written about the Rhythm Master series. We've got Rebecca Zorak, a scholar from Chicago, who wrote about his public projects, some of which we looked at yesterday, like the windows made for the Washington Cathedral. The artist Aria Dean wrote a really interesting essay on a kind of large drawing that he did that deals with a book called Black Empire and sort of connects to his interest in Afrofuturism. Madeleine Grinstein, who's the director of the MCA Chicago, wrote a really interesting essay about studio practice. And then Catherine Hoog, who's the curator of the show in Zurich, wrote about his woodblock prints. And then Darby English, an amazing scholar who's written a brilliant text on Kerry's painting of the policeman. Darby wrote about the new paintings, the new 8 paintings, and it's an extraordinary essay. Right, so now with 3 more minutes, just to introduce today's session. So we've got 3 sessions today. Who's Afraid of Red, Black and Green? The History of Afrocentrism, Black Nationalism, Garveyism in Kerry James Marshall's Practice. And then the influence of film on the career of Kerry James Marshall. And then later in the afternoon, Kerry James Marshall, African Histories and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. We're going to begin. I'm going to pass over to Nikita Sena Quarshie. So Nikita is an incredible young curator who's become a great friend in the last couple of years, who has been just amazing on this exhibition, working here at the Royal Academy over the last year or so. Also, as I said, curated the show at the Tabernacle and contributed to the catalogue. And brilliant things lie ahead of her. So welcome, Nikita.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to see faces from yesterday and to welcome new ones. It feels like we're building a community, maybe a critical community around Kerry's work. I'm really excited to introduce the first session of today with Dr. Sampada Aranke, Dr. Nydia A. Swaby, and Dr. Aleema Gray. This session is very much a continuation of the conversations we were having yesterday around color, specifically the color black, but how it sits along red and green. The 3 colors recur across Kerry's works. Today we'll be looking at them as both color, chroma, pigment, as an aesthetic, but also its socio-political implications. So how they've allowed Kerry to look at the histories of Black nationalism, Afrocentrism, and also Garveyism as well. So I'm really excited to have the presentations by all 3 in a follow-up conversation. I'll introduce Dr. Sampada Aranke first, who is an associate professor of art history and comparative Comparative Studies, at Ohio State University. Dr. Aleema Gray is a Jamaican-born activist, researcher, and curator. Dr. Nydia Swaby is a curator, archivist, and researcher. So I'll let them start ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Wow. Thank you all for being here at 10 o'clock, coming back. It's soggy outside. I want to thank the Getty team and everybody at the Royal Academy who've just been such generous and great hosts. How incredible is it that we share a timeline with Kerry James Marshall? You know, we all get to, every time I see that work, any work, I just feel like decades could go by and I can learn so much. So I'm grateful to Kerry for, Kerry's parents for making Kerry, for Kerry, taking on the life's work of study, of Black study that is his art. So I'm grateful for that. Okay, where's my clicker? Here we go. Most of us know what it's like on some level to see in the dark. We know implicitly the ways our eyes adjust to what doctors call scotopic vision or dark adaptation, those mechanics the eye conducts to be able to make sense of low light. We know what it feels like to open our eyes, our sleepy eyes, the blurry textures of our rooms swallowed in night. What it means to fumble around for things near, to squint our eyes as we prop ourselves up and adjust to the deep, rich contours of the room around us. Kerry James Marshall's Black painting pictures a relatable, intimate scene, and in his work, Blackness swallows the environment. This is a considered and meticulous combination of multiple hues of the color black, some more purple, others more gray, and still others tinged with the pinkness in their outer glow. This compositional feat pictures a scene right before a violent murder. Marshall pictures a room with a figure reading in bed. In this room, we can barely make out contextual clues, a banner that reads "Power to the People," with the panther featured front and center, a copy of Angela Y. Davis's "If They Come in the Morning," a jewelry stand that is a clenched fist. These details gesture towards what is pictured, but the painting itself is hard to decipher in its entirety. In this work, Marshall depicts the bedroom of Black Panther Fred Hampton, the famed and well-respected 21-year-old chairman of the Chicago chapter. Hampton and Mark Clark, a 22-year-old member of the party, were gunned down on December 4th, 1969 in Hampton's home by the FBI and Chicago Police Department. By 1969, the Panthers were synonymous with internationalist Black revolutionary struggle, drawing upon the work of Marcus Garvey, among others, and the Chicago chapter was particularly significant in the party's efficacy, in no small part due to Hampton's leadership. The police raided the apartment in the middle of the night where several members of the party were staying, including Hampton's pregnant partner, Akua. Court filings estimate that between 82 and 99 shots were fired within the apartment. In Marshall's painting, the viewer's perspective is from the apartment's back door, the same door from which the FBI and Chicago Police Department would eventually raid and kill Hampton in his bed lying next to Akua. The 1971 documentary film, The Murder of Fred Hampton, a still of which is shown in front of you, offers a rare and devastating glimpse into the apartment just after the raid. The aftermath of Hampton and Clark's gruesome murder evidences a home shattered by state violence, a violation left as is, as if to send a message to anyone who dare challenge the status quo. In the documentary, the camera acts as our eyes, offering an evidentiary view of the horrors of that evening and inviting a way of looking that is direct, unwavering, and clear as day. While viewers arrive at the painting with varying degrees of knowledge about the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, or 20th century Black radical history writ large, we are given none of this event of Hampton's murder directly in the painting. Instead, Marshall gives us the calm and comforting scene of a domestic space. We're given the intimacy of a familiar nighttime routine, the quiet stuff of everyday life. Black painting is a measured and considered activation of what theorist and poet Edouard Glissant has rightfully called a right to opacity. After all, the artist takes a transparent structure, fiberglass, and paints it black, literally transforming the material's transparent surface into an opaque one. Marshall's painting is a meditation on the dynamism of the color black in all its shades, pigments, and hues, as well as the social and sensorial modes that make black life a subject for composition. Indeed, the social chromatism of the color black entangles questions of aesthetics, politics, and social relations. If, as Zoe Hopkins called it yesterday, invisibility is a theory of color, then Marshall's own response to the question of blackness in his painting speaks volumes. In a 24 interview with curator Dieter Roystratte, Marshall asks a question central to the use of his color black. How do you render an object, he asks, with real volume without destroying the depth of blackness? In a provisional answer to his own question, he offers up his dedication to visualizing density. Quote, I'm always looking to create mass. The challenge is how to handle the way light falls on a black object without allowing it to destroy the form, but merely to reveal it. Marshall's material inquiries at the level of depth, mass, light, and form bring us to the broader implications of painting scenes of black life with and through black paints, plural. The viewer is asked to make black out of black, to sit with the obfuscations that make a will to transparency impossible and opacity irresistible. By working toward a form that would give room for light to hit someone or something black without destroying it, the artist motivates a considered relationship to the painting that measures the play between paint and person and the textures, contours, and shades of knowledge that are obscured and revealed in fractals, fragments, or fleeting whims. This may be why Marshall's painting feels like a protective gesture for both the subjects and objects of the work, as if Marshall is offering an invitation to extend this notion of mass to us, the masses. At this point in our time together, I want to take us on an errant path towards Marshall's unique attention to the relational qualities of mass. That path starts with Barnett Newman, whose 1969 seminal work, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue 4, is a provocation and invitation. Newman, a devout anarchist color field painter, believed that painting could stage an encounter with the sublime. After World War II, he, like so many others, wondered what painting could do in the wake of such catastrophic global crises. One way he approached a voice in the face of this overwhelming question is through the zip, his solve for a way to stage these encounters. There are far too many things to say about the zip, but I want to focus on its verticality, the way it offers a mirror where the viewer's presupposed upright body is thrown into a system of expressive meditation. We are invited in through the zip, through its approximation to a human body, a subjective way into and out of the painting and our world. Marshall is clearly taken by Newman, as evidenced by his 2012 exhibition, Who's Afraid of Red, Black, and Green? Fear in Marshall's iteration becomes a cheeky reversal, posing a question about what it is and why it is that red, black, and green would incite fear in the viewer. The chromatic nod, of course, to the colors of the Pan-African flag, a Garveyite method to think through a Black global solidarity, is also a kind of declarative gesture. And while Black painting subtracts the green and red from the scene explicitly, I see Marshall nodding to Newman's provocation. However, in keen Black radical aesthetic form, Marshall takes the verticality of the zip and flips it 90 degrees to give us an invitation more horizontal, more grounded in embodied spectatorship. And I'm also thinking here about like the bed, right, as giving us this linear line, and the figure who's reclined, right, not upright as is presumed by Newman. Okay, here we go. The mass of black that sweeps left to right on the plane is more akin to a tradition of black art that is closer to the legendary Harlem Renaissance innovator and painter Aaron Douglas. Douglas's 1934 mural, Aspects of Negro Life, features the artist's famed silhouette, here deployed as 4 history murals. In front of you is the second mural, From Slavery to Reconstruction, a sweeping and demonstrative work that mobilizes what I'm calling a bruised palette of purples, deep blues, and tans. I call this palette bruised because of Douglas's incredible use of the spectrum of dark chromatic arrangements that approximate an embodied mark, a fading and ever-present wound left on the body by the ongoing afterlives of slavery that compose U.S. racism and white supremacy. In Douglas's panel, this bruising is a collective chromatic arrangement, one emblematized by the simultaneous deployment of flatness and depth in the image, combined by the artist's particular attention to the figure. The figures here are represented through silhouette, a visual device that does not portray specific historic agents and thus creates a dialogue between the individual and collective, between the named and unnamed actors that shaped Black American history. I'm gripped by Douglas's use of silhouette, particularly for what I see as a means of creating space for collective identification. The abundance of figures that line the canvas left to right, again horizontal, fill our vision, and by extension, the viewer is invited into the scene to think about her own subject position in regards to the figures before her. Here, verticality and horizontality come together, and racial fault lines draw a line between the viewer and painting in order to offer a lesson, a mode of pedagogical instruction in the ongoingness of history. The masses are active historical agents in the present, and we are involved in the production of history through the viewing act. Drawing a line from Douglas to Newman, I believe that Marshall activates the viewer in Black painting by visualizing and activating this density. What strikes me about Marshall's rendering is how difficult it is he makes to see the work entirely. This sense of protection and care is particularly illuminated by how Marshall makes his viewer work to see the painting in partial and perspectival fragments, rather. I think, and this is close to yesterday what Sandra called Marshall's particular way of provoking us to see differently. I think this is in that spirit. Relying on sight alone frustrates the viewer because the image is impossible to take in its entirety. I saw that somebody was like, can you turn the lights down, right? Even in this context. In order to catch glimpses, the viewer must pace from one edge of the painting to the other, squat, angle her head up, peer by getting as close to, and then back up as far away from the painting as possible. In other words, she must move her own body, be aware of her own scale and proximity to the work, take stock of her own perspectival possibilities and limitations. Here, I believe, Marshall makes a case for the embodied qualities of the look and opens up the relational capacities of Blackness. Blackness is pictured, seen, even felt as relational and active. It is about an aesthetic position that opens up a set of questions between figure and ground, subject and object, pictured and seen. In order to get into these questions, the viewer must take a position in relation to the painting, activate a mode of looking that is deeply embodied, and reflect upon the relations made possible if we think of Blackness as a general field of sensibility, a mass that moves through and against sight itself. So then, If sight requires our action, our lived experience mobilized in real time and place, then how do we move in this world? Perhaps this is where we can return to Fred Hampton, who too believed in the power of the masses. We might attune these lessons in looking into lessons in action, in being, remembering that we live in the future tense that Hampton dreamed of. Perhaps taking with us this active and activating way of looking, we might renew how we live for the people. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Nikita, Aleema, Mark, Laron, and everyone from Black Curatorial, the RA, and the Getty who helped to shape this symposium. I'm honored to be here to think with Kerry James Marshall's engagement with Garveyism and Pan-African aesthetics as it unfolds in the red, black, and green room of Kerry James Marshall's The Histories, and to bring that work into dialogue with the life and legacy of Pan-African feminist Amy Ashwood Garvey. So Kerry James Marshall has described his practice as a counter-archive, one that insists on Black figure representation within the Western art canon by engaging the very traditions of painting that rendered Black life invisible, reminding us that Black presence is not an interruption, but a return. His figures, painted in multiple shades of deep, saturated Black, assert a visibility and a presence, and he turns to the everyday, the living room, the bedroom, the barber shop, the historical, the political, and the spiritual, treating each of these as worthy of documentation. In the red, black, and green room, this meditation on visibility and presence takes form as Marshall reimagines the colors of the Pan-African flag, red for the blood that binds us, black for the people, green for the land, into a series of, quote, cheeky and layered works that also references the connected histories of painting and erotica. First adopted by Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1920, these colors would become the color palette of Black power, the Black arts movement, and Rastafari visual culture, where they signal liberation, dignity, and the spiritual politics of return. But Marshall doesn't treat them as fixed or sacred symbols. He imagines them instead through, quote, stylish and sexy images, and we are left to ask if Garvey's political project remains relevant today. That question, what remains of Marcus Garvey's vision, and how we see it refracted in the present, resonates closely with the central argument of my book, Amy Ashwood Garvey and the Future of Black Feminist Archives. In that text and in my ongoing work, visual work on Amy Ashwood Garvey, I use her archive, life, and activism to ask what it means to build a kind of a counter-archive that looks forward as much as it looks back, a Black feminist archive that refuses disappearance, insists on care, intimacy, and imagination as archival strategies, and foregrounds Black women not only as subjects of history, but as architects of its future. Through my writing and visual practice, I have tried to reinsert Amy Ashwood Garvey into the intellectual, political, and visual histories from which she has been left out, and to reimagine what a future-oriented Black feminist or Pan-African feminist archive might make possible. Known affectionately as Gardy by her adopted daughters, Auntie Amy by the Caribbean students she mentored, and Bahima by her West African friends, Amy Ashwood Garvey was a Pan-African feminist, activist, orator, playwright, publisher, restaurant owner, author, art collector, sociologist, and social worker. An early Black internationalist, throughout her life, Amy Ashwood Garvey moved between cities in South America, North America, West Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. She was born in Jamaica, spent her early childhood in Panama, later migrating to the US and UK. She had a home in London, family in Kingston, an office in Harlem, and land in the Ashanti region. Each of these experiences and migrations shaped her identity and consciousness as a Black woman of the African diaspora. Amy was also the first wife of Pan-African leader Marcus Garvey, and she played a pivotal role in the formation of the UNIA, a transnational Black national membership organization that still exists. She co-founded its newspaper, The Negro World, created the Women's Division, and served as one of the first directors of the Black Star Line, the UNIA steamship company that aimed to link Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas through trade and migration. Yet despite this foundational work, Ashwood Garvey has largely been written out of the history of the UNIA. Indeed, Marcus Garvey's vision of women's role in the movement never quite matched with her own sense of herself as a co-founder and leader of that organization. Her refusal to be secondary and her insistence that Black revolution could not rest on masculinism, heroism alone, made her both vital and ultimately inconvenient to the official story. And that tension between visibility and erasure, present but pushed to the margins, shapes how we encounter her in the Black radical and Pan-African archive. When I entered the red, black, green room, those same tensions between visibility and absence, between memory and myth, shaped how I encountered two particular paintings, Untitled Male Nude and Black Star 2, paintings that do not simply use the colors of the Pan-African flag, they trouble them, asking what remains of the political charge of the colors, red, black, and green, once they enter the realm of desire and fantasy. In Untitled Male Nude, a Black man reclines across a bed, his body soft, unguarded. The label text reminds us that artists like Goya and Manet made the reclining nude their domain, but always with white women as objects of desire. Marshall decidedly inserts a Black man's body into that lineage. The Pan-African flag lies gently across his pelvis, concealing what might be arousal. Once a banner of militant collectivity, the colors red, black, and green now signal rest, eroticism, and perhaps vulnerability, and so we are left with a question that feels to me profoundly archival. What new memory is made when the flag touches skin? And what political meaning emerges when a symbol of movement, of marching and mass meetings, and is absorbed into the private space of the body? In Black Stars 2, a woman stands at the center of the canvas, framed by the radiating red and green star. The exhibition text notes that Marshall's imagined model, quote, becomes a black star, a direct star to the Black Star Line. But here, the star is not merely a logo for transatlantic shipping. It is a halo, a compass, a burst of cosmological energy. And the woman at the center is the navigator, the axis around which the whole composition turns. If Garvey imagined the Black Star Line as a vessel for collective return, futurity, and commerce, Marshall imagines another kind of return, one rooted through desire, femininity, and visual pleasure. The woman grips the star as though steering her own symbolic vessel. Her gaze unsettles the very question of who gets to be the trace of Pan-African aspiration. These paintings revise Garvey's Pan-African aesthetics. Marshall takes the colors historically mobilized through a masculinist grammar of ships, uniforms, marches, speeches, and reroutes them through the erotic, the tender. He produces a counter-archive, not only by insisting on Black presence, but by insisting that desire itself is a site of political knowledge. And in his hands, the colors red, black, and green become sensuous carriers of memory, pleasure, and possibility. And these are precisely the kinds of moves, the insistence on feeling, care, and sensuality, aesthetics as political labor, that I know Amy Ashwood Garvey understood. Her archive is full of photographs where style, presence, posture, and pleasure become part of her political vocabulary, and she knew that the power of looking and being looked at as a form of self-authorship. And yet, as I stood in that room, I found myself wondering, would Amy Ashwood Garvey recognize herself here? The Amy who left behind an extraordinary photographic archive of her life across continents, the Amy who refused to be diminished in the history she helped to shape. In the years immediately following her separation from Marcus, it was theater that became her tool for cultural critique, her first arena for interrogating the masculinist posturing and gendered contradictions she had witnessed inside the UNIA. She began producing musical comedies with her new lover, Trinidadian calypso singer Sam Manning, and by the 1920s, they were staging plays at Harlem's Lafayette Theater, lively, sharp productions that explored how race, class, and gender and desire shaped Black communities and domestic life. Spaces where laughter, music, satire, and performance became methods of Black cultural critique. For example, Hey Hey satirized respectability politics and the fragile ego of disappointed husbands. The Amsterdam News tried to frame her through her proximity to Marcus, calling her, quote, the African president's former wife. But Amy used this stage to flip that narrative, to mock precisely the forms of patriarchal authority that had pushed her to the margins of the organization she had co-founded. I think then that if there is a place in this room where Amy Ashwood Garvey might most immediately recognize herself, it is in keeping the culture. In this work, we encounter a Black couple posed mid-dance in what the wall label names as an Afro-futurist household. the lean towards one another with a familiarity that feels like a portrait of domestic partnership and pleasure. And they are painted in that deeply textured Black we have come to recognize as emblematic of Marshall's work. But Marshall's commitment to Black figure representation extends beyond the bodies of the couple in the space itself, to the space itself. The room around them seems to hover in cosmic space, unmoored from linear time. African sculptures rest beside modernist furniture, textiles map the walls, and a hologram of the globe tilts subtly towards Africa, as if reorienting the axis of the world. And here the family living room becomes a diasporic archive, a room composed of the objects where memory, intimacy, longing, and belonging converge. The room becomes a map of what Black people have carried, kept, and cherished. The domestic sphere is not mundane, but a site where culture is actively made, where the aesthetics of diasporic survival are refined and repurposed. And when I look at that painting through Amy, I see her clearly, because she too understood that the home, and by extension, the homes away from home that Black people collectively create as a stage for political world-making. And she helped the UNIA's cultural arm organizing concerts, literary events, and theatrical performances at Liberty Hall, the UNIA meetings place, to attract new members. Like Marshall's imagined interior, Amy's cultural production created rooms of the future, spaces where art, politics, and social life are inseparable. Diasporic living rooms where collective care, political analysis, sensuality, and artistic experimentation converged. One of those living rooms was the Florence Mills Social Parlor and Restaurant in Soho, which Amy opened in 1935 with her partner, Trinidadian calypso singer Sam Manning, as I said. Named in honor of the Black American cabaret singer who had used her fame to advocate for the Black community, the Florence Mills quickly became legendary. It was one of the few clubs in London that catered almost exclusively to a Black clientele. And it was decorated with artwork, it's been said it was decorated with artwork that Amy collected during her travels and offered a menu of Caribbean, African, and African-American fare. And on any given night, Sam and his orchestra filled the air with calypso and jazz. After intermissions, there might be comedy, and then the floor was cleared and people danced into the night to calypso, swing, or even the foxtrot. Jesse Owens stopped by, so did Fats Waller, Benny Carter, and Reginald Forsyth, who was called the Duke Ellington of Britain. The New York Amsterdam News called it the headquarters for Negroes in the English metropolis. The London Sunday Express said it was the place where race intellectuals from all parts came together, and they did. C.L.R. James, George Padmore, and T. Ross McConan remembered the Florence Mills with affection. James recalled heated debates on colonialism and fascism carried out over plates of rice and peas. McConan described it as one of the most famous venues in London where people of African descent felt at home. The Florence Mills was also a political hub. The International African Friends of Abyssinia was formed there in response to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and soon after, the International African Service Bureau replaced it. Amy was again at the center, helping to launch journals like the Africa World and the International African Opinion, participating in protests in Trafalgar Square. If keeping the culture teaches us that the domestic sphere is inseparable from political world-making, then Amy's presence at the 5th Pan-African Congress, which was held in Manchester, England in 1945, is a reflection of that work. She was one of the only 2 women on a panel, carrying into that formal political arena the same insights that inspired the Florence Mills and shaped her cultural work within the UNIA. And she used that platform to name that Pan-African discourse preferred not to see, that Black women's labor, the women who worked in the fields, carried goods to the market, tended households, and did the work of keeping the culture that literally kept Black communities alive, was a ground on which movement stood yet remained unacknowledged. Her interventions shaped several of the Congress's resolutions, the first to address women's rights and labor conditions, and yet in the official minutes, she all but disappears. After the war, Amy continued this kind of cultural work. In the 1950s, she transformed her home in Ladbroke Grove into the Afro Women's Center and Residential Club. Its aims were to, quote, promote the welfare of women of color and to meet their spiritual, cultural, social, and political needs. But in practice, it was part restaurant, part boarding house, part welfare house, part social salon. Women from the Caribbean and Africa found rooms, meals, and guidance on work and immigration. Activists organized there. Students came for cultural events. New arrivals found community. Amy soon welcomed women of Asian descent, white working class women, and sex workers, recognizing that their struggles around housing, labor, and survival were entangled with those of Black women. And eventually she renamed the Afro People's Center to reflect a wider vision, and it became the home of several anti-racist organizations. Today, a blue plaque marks that building, a small public acknowledgement of the work of keeping the culture that happened inside. Like many descendants of enslaved Africans, Amy longed and dreamed to traveling to the continent. In 1946, that dream came true when she went to West Africa and traced her family back to Yuaban in Ashanti, where her great-grandmother had been kidnapped as a teenager and taken to Jamaica to work on a plantation. The community there welcomed her as kin and gave her the new name, her grandmother's name, Bahima, in a lineage ceremony. These photographs from Accra in 1949 show her among women friends, relaxing, laughing at ease. And they remind us that her politics was never only speeches and congresses, but also the everyday practices of visiting, listening, and friendship. These gatherings are a part of the Counter Archive too, another register of keeping the culture. Her inclusion in the Kwame Nkrumah Pan-African Intellectual and Cultural Festival at the University of Ghana in 2021, her portrait was displayed alongside other foremothers of Pan-Africanism, extends that archive into the present. Amy's travels through West Africa and her connections with African women's movements. She later wrote that she was struck by the conditions of women in the home, and during those 3 years, she gave talks on women's rights, education, and political participation, and helped to establish around 15 women's organizations. And at the same time, she was documenting these encounters through essays such as The Librarian Woman, her planned book, Mother Africa, photographs, letters, press clippings. Taken together, they formed yet another counter-archive, a record that unsettles the masculinist geography of Pan-Africanism by centering women's leadership, domestic roles, and everyday labor. And in gathering these stories, in listening, writing, collecting, and carrying them across borders, Amy was also keeping the culture. She treated women's knowledge, women's rooms, women's political work as the ground of diasporic continuity. Her archive makes visible the quiet, relational practices that sustained Pan-African visions long before they appeared in manifestos or Congress resolutions. And while in Accra, Amy began wearing kente, a practice she continued for the rest of her life. And she wore it to key events and for her studio portraits, using dress as a visual language of return. And she didn't only wear kente, she collected it alongside African sculptures, beadworks, and textiles she gathered through her travels. And these objects were a part of her early Pan-African effort to keep a culture, to preserve and circulate in Africanist aesthetics, forms of against colonial narratives of lack. In Amy's hands, kente became a counter-archive, a way of carrying Ashanti lineage and Pan-African connection into every room she entered. My own research into Amy's use of kente and the meanings behind what she wore through fieldwork in Ghana's markets and weaving communities is one way I've tried to stay with that gesture. Photographing and writing about the cloth becomes another way of keeping that culture, reading fabric as archive. Lastly, I want to end on Amy Ashwood Garvey's archive, which at the National Library of Jamaica, which I recently saw, and I felt it felt really important for me to intentionally bring Jamaica in the room, given the recent hurricane that happened there. Boxes of correspondence, photographs, receipts, drafts of speeches, and tiny notes about rent, menus, and travel recovered from her home in Kingston after her death. On one level, they are remains of a life lived across the Black world. On another, they are evidence of the labor involved in keeping the culture, the admin of liberation, the paperwork of care. My own engagement with this material through writing, filmmaking, and curating is part of the same counter-archival practice. These materials are not static. They move through researchers, exhibitions, and conversations like this one. And to work with Amy's archive is to join into a chain of caretakers and to recognize ourselves as a part of a living counter-archive that she began. And so through both Kerry James Marshall and Amy Ashwood Garvey, I have began to glimpse a shared practice of reinscription, bringing Black life into view where history has obscured it. Marshall does this through paint, insisting on Black figures and Black interiors and spaces that once refused them. Amy does it through activism, performance, hospitality, and writing, through the art and of living and keeping the culture. Both offer what I think of as a counter-archive of Pan-African feminism, living records of how art and politics sustain one another. To keep the culture in their hands is not simply to preserve the past, but to treat memory as a creative act, making the usable past and the future imaginable. Thank you.
Wow, Wow. I forgot that I was presenting. I was enjoying the conversation so much. I was like, oh, wait, it's my turn. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody's feeling well. It's such a joy and a privilege and an honor to be here. I want to thank Alia, the Black Curatorial team, Getty, RA, Nikita, and everybody that's been involved in pulling this wonderful symposium together that's really helping us, or challenging us, I suppose, to think differently about how we see and how we historicize and ultimately participate in the ongoing labor of cultural memory. The provocation, who is afraid of black, red, and green, is one that sits very close to my heart. And thinking deeply, as I was sitting there and I was listening to the presentations, thinking deeply about the visual and the intellectual resonances of Pan-Africanism and its ongoing legacies today. It's not really a simple thing. There's multiple layers to this thing. It operates on many different levels, and I'm speaking particularly from a place which is actually where Amy Ashford Garvey is from, Portland, Jamaica. Speaking from the context from which I was born, Jamaica, the Caribbean, or I suppose from which I was displaced. It operates on so many different levels. The spiritual, the personal, the ancestral. And so I think it's important, what I wanted to do is start, this provocation with that lived realm of what it means to be operating within this kind of color palette. Because for many of us, particularly where I'm from, when I think about the first time that I became familiar with the color palettes of black, red, and green, it's probably through the sonic, through the words, to the sound and the power. I'm going to save us all the pain of hearing me sing. But I'm thinking about the songs of Burning Spear, of Ken Boots, where he kind of sits down and he says, meet me by the river, right over there, black, red, and green, chanting the rainbow, chanting Africa as we return. So I want to start with that as a kind of spatial imagination of what it means, the affective, the lived, the personal that's kind of moving between. So this is kind of where I want to begin this conversation. As we turn to Kerry James Marshall's work, how do these colors, black, red, and green, continue to shape the ways in which we see and make meaning? What forms of imagination becomes possible when we treat these colors not just as symbols of resistance, but as tools for making and thinking? And how might Marshall's practice help us to reconsider the labor of representation itself, what it costs, what it sustains, and what it makes visible? My work, I suppose, sits at the intersection of public history and curatorial practice and community research. You describe me as an activist, which sounds amazing. I'm not an activist. But I suppose I describe myself as a public historian because I'm really, really interested in this idea of the doing, the verb, the doing of history. The processes through which knowledge is produced and circulated, and the meaning making of the everyday, working across both the academy, the museums and institutions, as well as the grassroots. I've often found that we're kind of constantly existing within this structural absence. There seems to be, no matter how much we try, there's this Eurocentrism, this kind of Eurocentric logic. There's where we think about blackness and using whiteness as a starting point to think through blackness. So there was a challenge that I had, particularly with a lot of my research. And at one point, which actually became the title of my PhD, Born Babylon, I decided perhaps it might take us to actually start from over Dessa as opposed to over Yassa. So a lot of the work that I do is thinking through a lens of anti-disciplinary. I founded House of Dread, a anti-disciplinary heritage studio. And when we say anti-disciplinary, it's not necessarily to reject the discipline altogether, but it's really to challenge the epistemological boundaries that structure what counts as knowledge and who is recognized as the knower. It is a refusal of the hierarchical separation between theory and practice, between art and history, the archive and the everyday. Antidisciplinary allows us to think through the multiple inheritances, the spiritual, the sonic, the material. And so the starting point for this provocation for me is this question that I think perhaps makes a nice roundup to all of the conversations that we've been having this morning. And it is a provocation put forward by Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, in 1941, following the defeat of Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. And he kind of puts out this message to say, we've done the job, what shall we do with the tools? And we can speak a lot about, I'm sure many of us are familiar with, the symbolism of Ethiopia as operating as this kind of front line of Black sovereignty. But I start with this question, because for me it's not just a rhetorical, but it's really a meditation on the aftermath of struggle, on the responsibilities that come after liberation. Once the battle has been won, what becomes the instruments, literal and symbolic, that has sustained it? This question resonates profoundly within the African diaspora, where tools of resistance have always been material and imaginative, the language, the rhythm, the ritual, the representation. But it's also, I think, a provocation guiding this reflection on Kerry James Marshall's practice. What do we do with the tools of representation once visibility has been achieved? How do we transform the symbolic into structural? And so Ethiopia occupies a very powerful conceptual, spiritual place in the diasporic imagination, both real and imagined, as a site through which the dream of liberation has been narrated and reimagined across generations. And we can talk a lot about Pan-Africanism and Garveyism. I guess my contribution, particularly coming from a Rastafari tradition, is kind of putting in a Rastafari perspective. Rastafari have been at the heart of many of the conversations around Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and what it means. And potentially within a framework, they've added a new color to the color palette of gold, gesturing to the material politics, the spiritual luminosity. So this gesture is very profound, but I guess it speaks to this divine imagination. And I think this for me is when we're thinking about art and we're thinking about this as a kind of spiritual technology, the tools that have enabled Black people, Black communities to envision themselves beyond conquest, beyond captivity. This is a thread that I want to follow today, I suppose, or end with today, how the imaginative, the spiritual, and the creative intertwine to form a living toolkit. I begin once again with this question. We have done the job, what shall we do with the tools to capture this tension between freedom as an event and freedom as a practice? It's asked not only how liberation is won, but how it is maintained. How do we break the chains? How are we building new worlds? And for this, I think Kerry James Marshall offers a response to these questions. His practice functions, as Dr. Swaby was speaking to us, as a counter-archive, a visual strategy that interrogates how history is constructed, who is allowed to appear within it. And the important point here, I think, really, as we're talking about some of the questions around imagination, is really that imagined realm. How are we imagining otherwise? Marshall has spoke about this, particularly within institutional structures that shape and govern artistic value and visibility, keeping with the culture, as pictured here. Marshall asks, for me, what does preservation mean? What does it look like? Moving beyond the kind of institutional framework. And I think there's something here important about forcing us to reconsider time. What do we mean when we talk about time? Preserving culture is not just, an essence of in his paintings, but it's really this, for me, this archival impulse that freezes the past. Instead, Marshall kind of treats time as, in this painting, very layered, simultaneous field where past and present and future converge on a canvas. His work, particularly, speaking as a historian, kind of collapses the historical distance. The flat chromatic black evokes centuries of representation. The monumental scale, the motifs, the everyday domesticity, this temporality resists this kind of linearity, which I think is important, particularly when thinking about Western notions of time being something that we can take, manage, and recover. For those of us within the African and Caribbean diaspora, time has often been disrupted and stolen through slavery, fractured through displacement, and compressed the kind of urgency of survival. So there's this element of the questions around preservation and care, and I think these questions are very important, particularly for curators and those of us who are working across collections. and liberating collections as well. That the narratives, when we're thinking about what are the narratives that remain kind of disremembered, for me, Marshall's project has been to kind of intervene into that system, to make visible what has been systematically obscured. In this sense, the canvases operate not necessarily as this kind of representations, but for me, a tool, a methodological tool, an instrument in thinking about pedagogy, in thinking about repair, in thinking about power. And so when he tells us in one of his conversations, you can't be neutral in the face of invisibility, I turn this question to those of us who are curators, cultural producers, memory workers, historians. If we are confronted with these ongoing realities of invisibility, the question becomes, what does this mean for our work? Many of us working across arts and heritage institutions and cultural institutions face this tension daily. There is no neutrality in the face of invisibility. What might it mean to approach our practice as historians through the logic of creative method, to learn from artistic practice rather than merely interpret it? If I was an artist, which I'm not, history would probably be my paintbrush in a sense, that we're making visible the tensions, the omissions, and the silences that structure our collective memory. This too is very much intentional work. It is not easy work. There's multiple layers to this work. So how do we think with it? How do we think with the silences? How can we remain mindful that our negotiations take place within a broader historical landscape marked by enslavement, marked by segregation, marked by systems of erasure and violence? There is a violence. But I think Marshall's work emerges from this, this reality. It operates against this backdrop of displacement and erasure, and it works within that kind of very complex paradox. Visibility, while necessary, is not inherently emancipatory. Representation can reproduce the same hierarchies that is trying to undo if it is not accompanied by structural transformation. So as historians and as curators, we have a responsibility to acknowledge this complexity. Our role is not just to record what has been made visible, but also to interrogate the conditions under which visibility becomes possible. And so when we're returning to the provocation, we've done the job, what shall we do with the tools? I want to suggest that the tools are not only material, but conceptual. They include the practices of representation, of refusal, and imagination that sustain Black cultural production. Representation remains crucial, but it must be accompanied by a refusal, the capacity to reject containment and to resist visibility on imposed terms. And imagination then becomes that bridge. It becomes the bridge that links memory to possibility. So Marshall's work invites us to treat art and history as part of the same continuum of labor. Both are modes of making the past usable in the present. Marshall's practice, viewed through Selassie's provocation, reminds us that the aftermath of liberation requires its own methodology. It demands that we think critically about what we inherit, what we choose to carry forward. Artistic practice becomes, in this context, a form of historical labor, one that does not simply fill the gap in representation, but reimagines the framework through which history itself is made possible. The challenge and the opportunity lies in how we use the tools, how we sharpen them for future work. To work within the tools, then, is to reconfigure them, to use them to build new infrastructures of knowledge, new architectures of care, and new ways of seeing that move beyond survival towards transformation. So the question that I'm leaving is, what do we want history to do for us? Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for such brilliant presentations. I felt so much giddiness while listening to all three of you, because it is so exciting to be able to see the way your work threads with Kerry's and the different journeys you follow throughout it. as you were speaking, there was a quote that kept coming to mind, and I'm really glad I printed it out today, because I hoped that it might be useful. And it's from a conversation between Kerry and Charles Gaines. And Kerry says, what I am doing is establishing a presence, a Black presence that isn't traumatically conditioned by its relationship to a practice or structure called racism. And that was going through my mind as I was listening, first to you, Sampada, the way in which you speak about Black painting, the quality of Blackness in it as a mass, with its depth, with its multi-layered hues and qualities. Since yesterday, I've been thinking about luminosity a lot because of Njideka, of course. But even within that painting, there's a resistance to it only being about the violence of Fred Hampton's death. There's still the intimacy of two lovers in bed. There's still the intimacy of romance, even within the backdrop of the turmoil of that period of the 60s. And then also with Nydia and Aleema, there's still this insistence on black, red, and green as an erotic color. The sonic qualities that come out through the archive of Amy, its importance, the colors as a political drive, as one that moves us socially, politically. Sorry, that was just something I wanted to get out quickly, but I would love to hear your thoughts on, especially going off from your presentation, Aleema, what does a contemplation of those colors require from us as cultural workers, as curators, as writers, as archivists? It would be great to hear your thoughts from your various modes of work.
Okay, I'm happy to go first. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about, which I didn't have the space to explore in my paper, I was thinking quite a bit about how all of the photographs of Amy Ashwood Garvey are not in color, and thinking about how I had never really kind of thought with that before, prior to thinking about Marshall's use of red, black, and green as political colors, and unteasing them and thinking about the erotic and thinking about the feminine. So, for me, in one way, I began to think about the images as potentially having color, even in their as they are black and white. And one of the things I had to remove from a slide because I've already done too much, was in trying to read color into a series of these very beautiful portraits of her that are in black and white that I've collected from the Schomburg Center, from the John Hope Franklin Research Center, from the National Library of Jamaica, and I was going to try to kind of think of that in that presence. And so for me, I was really struck by that and thinking about, actually what we know about these colors, red, black, and green, are actually through narrative and through story. We don't actually see any images of Amy Ashwood Garvey and wearing those colors indeed, or having that as a part of her, embedded with her. So it really gave me a sense of actually thinking about the colors more as a thing around symbols and around meaning and around structure and around ideas and other ways of which I could read her kind of story in relation to that particular room of red, black, and green. So yeah, I think that's probably one reflection I would have back on it, was just to say that I was really struck by that in returning to her archive and trying to think with those colors, that I had to imagine it in a different way than actually being in the room itself.
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of what strikes me about the provocation, red, black, and green, for our theme, for our panel, is that I actually think that all of Marshall's use of any color is a use of the color black. And, for me, that's kind of embedded as a kind of refusal of this modernist notion in many ways that black is the absence of color. I think Marshall is really thinking about how black is the container for the range for all color in many ways. And we can see how that kind of material, artistic, conceptual idea extends out as an invitation, I think, to the relational, the social, the political. And so, for me, part of why I kind of I'm setting up this idea that we constantly return to black painting with just like little modifiers and adjustments, right? About how we see all these other colors, how these other explorations of colors are actually explorations of the color black. Even if Barnett Newman doesn't think that, right? Even if he says red, yellow, and blue, it's like, how is that, how can we kind of, again, bend time to look at Newman through Marshall now, right? And see that the way that, that blackness is not only not monolithic, it's also an extension of the like, I guess like a simple reversal might be the easiest way to do it. Like we only know color because we know black, because we have the gift of being able to see black. And that chromatic arrangement extends out to how we think about social relationships, intimate relationships, histories, collective identifications, all of those things I think are encapsulated if we just take the invitation to look at it all as a meditation on the color black.
Yeah, I think when I'm thinking about the color, I'm also thinking about, I suppose, part of this conversation is also about nationalism and flags and the meaning of flags, but particularly the meaning of flags for those of us within the diaspora that's kind of entangled with questions of rupture and disrepair and displacement and erasure. And so when I'm thinking through this color palette and the combination of them, I think there's a sadness. There's a sadness because there is a longing for something, but that longing is so unknowing. And I think this for me is an ongoing reminder of some of the challenges, but also the possibilities of what these colors kind of bring together. They bring in together this possibility of thinking about, all right, in this world that we're living in, what does unity look like? How can we develop, as what Rastafari would say, like unity, not uniformity, and what does this mean in terms of the social contracts that these flags, nationalism represents? Like, what role can that play today for I&I people? And I think there is a possibility, but an impossibility there. And I think that for me is a meditation, the sonic, the intimacies, but then also that pain. And what we do with that pain. And I think that, for me, is the role that art plays in kind of bringing together those conversations.
Yeah, and that really resonates, and I think in an interesting way connects with trying to look at Barnett Newman's through Kerry, because he was approaching a kind of spiritual pursuit, this idea of standing in front of it and having this transcendental experience in a way that kind of where identity representation falls apart. Meanwhile, Kerry's anchoring us in the reality of Black life, the reality of the Black experience through color, through gazing at a color like black and all its chromatic richness, but through colors like red, black, and green, which like has been discussed, can be a symbol, but it's a symbol anchored in the socioeconomic, class-based cultural realities of Black people, but also internationally. I loved that you spoke about how Amy connected the struggle of Black people with sex workers and people from different classes. It's an internationalist struggle. I would love, Sampada, if you could speak more about the idea of Black mass. I loved the anchoring of it within the voluminous nature of Blackness, but in connection to movements, Black nationalist movements, but also, and this is a question also for both of you, questions of failure, actually, and the way that Kerry plays with that in some of the paintings. I might try and find. When we look at a painting like this with all you're immediately drawn into the pastel pinks, the greens, the blues, the hearts, but you have a rolled up flag, the Garvey flags, it's as if it's no longer in use, or has been abandoned in the tire. There's a fire burning in the distance, there's unease, there's tension. I would love to, sorry, that's a really long-winded question, but think about Black mass in relation to movements and failure as well?
I'll start, but I am by no means the expert. What's interesting about your question, Nikita, is that part of this was a very weird talk, so thank you all for going with me on this journey, this experiment. But part of what I'm interested in kind of how Marshall thinks about mass, right? Because he talks about it in that interview that I quoted, is that he pays careful attention to how not to destroy, right? Destroy the very thing that he's trying to create. And one way we talked about it yesterday is when light hits it, right? How does it destroy or disrupt or deform the thing? And in what ways, when light hits it, does it work? I was telling Mark that the installation here of black painting is quite possibly the most stunning lighting I've ever seen on that work, because it doesn't try to shine a light on it in such a way to make it pop out of the frame. It actually just lets it live in the atmospheric glow of the light. And so for me, that kind of mass, the very kind of idea of mass being a density that doesn't have form, right, is the kind of colloquial understanding of it. But in fact, again, Marshall's inverting that and having us think about mass as how do you create form through mass? And the way to do that is through multiple deployments of the color black. And so there is a direct line, right, with destruction and failure, right? And it's a very delicate symbiotic relationship between the density of the color and the way that light could hit it, right? It's very careful consideration. So failures are already embedded in the logic of black painting, I think, in many ways. And I think it achieves that precisely by gesturing to the masses, right? Thinking about the Black Panther Party and the commitment to liberation through the people. It's wrapped up there. You kind of are welcomed into that space that's quite intimate, particularly through that knowledge of the collective. So I feel like that it is all kind of wrapped up in the scene. The failure, though, I want to just be very explicit, comes not by the failure of the people, it comes by the violence of the state. And that's the part that you hold in your body if you have any knowledge of Hampton, when you look at that, right? It's the violence that comes just moments after that you're anticipating in your body. I hold it in my shoulders when I'm looking at that work, right? Decades later, because it's coming. So that for me is really the way that black painting pops out into ourselves, into our sensorial selves, in order to activate a different way of looking that you can't simply do through the eye. But that failure is the state's, massive violence. It's not about the Panthers failing. It's not about a failure of nationalism or black nationalism. The rolled up flag is there because we need to unravel it soon, not because we don't need it anymore,
I think just kind of building on what you were saying, I think there's always a struggle with the word failure, and particularly from a people-led approach. I guess the word that I'm more thinking of is a trying. And when I look at the histories, when I look at the conversations and the discourses and the bringing together those discourses, what I'm really contending with is once again back to that conversation of the possibilities of the trying. And part of the trying comes with that iteration, right, of let's try over there. So okay, that's not working, let's pivot it. And I think, but at the same time, when I'm thinking about failure and the trying and the possibilities from an archival point of view, which is why I can listen to you talk about Amy Ashwood Garvey all day, but it's the fragments of the archive. And I think that's what sits close to that's what sits very heavy on my heart, is that when you're, I guess, sifting through material, that absence is overwhelming. And so part of the work is trying to pull together those fragments to make meaning of something. And I think the failure or the trying is coming from that kind of disruption of the material conditions that is allowing us to understand who we are, what we know, and to think through how do we find the tools to roll up the flag and say, what does this mean for us now as a community going forward?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Aleema, because I think when I see Kerry James Marshall's work and I see the references to red, black, and green, and I do see this kind of rolled up flag, I do see these like small references to the color, I don't see a failure. I think I similarly see a trying, but I also was thinking I see a presencing, a kind of reminder that even beneath these kind of moments where the kind of primary ideas that might be articulated is the idea that, say, black is beautiful, or that the club or the nightclub can be a radical political space, or this historical moment is an important moment that threads in these broader Pan-African narratives where I see these gestures of the color appear. It's about like the ever-presence of this kind of black radical tradition, of this idea around a kind of political internationalism that brought black people all together around the globe, and how that is deeply embedded in all of these everyday moments, in the barber shop, in the little imagery that's in the barber shop, it's embedded in the bedroom, it's in all these different spaces. So actually, I think it's important to say as well that like the UNIA might not have its same kind of grandeur, but it still exists and it still functions in really, really important ways in the everyday lives of its members, right? So it might not have the same kind of transnational reach or aim, but when you get down to like the local, there are UNIA groups, chapters all over the world, right? So I think it then begs the question, what is failure when it still exists in the kind of cultural heart of people who see themselves as Garveyites to this very day? And I get asked all the time in relation to my work on Amy Ashwood Garvey, are you a Garveyite? And it's always quite complicated. So I say that to say that for me, I didn't see failure at all. I saw it at kind of ever-presence, and that was what I felt like, oh, how can I bring Amy Ashwood Garvey into that ever-presence? And what ways in which can I read, I think the way in which Kerry James Marshall presents this presence, but also asks us, is it relevant today? In what way can I read that and weave a woman like Amy Ashwood Garvey into it? And it feels really important to say, I did Amy Ashwood Garvey because I work on Amy Ashwood Garvey. She's obviously not the only important woman that was foundational to the UNIA. Obviously, Marcus Garvey's second wife, Amy Jocks Garvey, is really important to the foundation of the UNIA. Henrietta Vinton, Dale Casely Hayford. I could go on and on about women that were in West Africa, that were in the Caribbean, that were in the United States, that were in the UK, Una Marson, who were all really central to this kind of articulation. So for me, in a way, I think if I could write a whole paper that tries to weave in each of these different little presencings across Kerry James Marshall's work and try to read a different Pan-African feminist figure into it. And so that's what I kind of felt more broadly. And actually, I feel quite excited about the opportunity, the invitation to take this like essay and think more around. I tried to be like, I have to focus on the red, black, and green room because it can be contained. But actually, I think you could see this thread across obviously the whole exhibition, because the references to that red, black, and green are literally in every single room. And so I think that's actually what I think he's trying to say with it. That yes, there's a significant exhibition he's done, there's a specific room, and I think that's quite beautiful about the curation, that it separated out what was previously brought together in Who's Afraid of Red, Black, and Green into these different spaces so we could see it throughout his oeuvre.
Yeah, and I really loved what you said about ever-presence, because it's true, something that struck me as I keep going through the show is that the red, black, and green is contained in the last room. But if you go from gallery to gallery, in the very first gallery, you have this image, the Academy, which we spoke so much about yesterday. This astounded me, the fingernail with the red, black, and green. It's such a tiny detail, and it's an embellishment and a mode of style. The flair of it is wonderful. You have it. This is my hypothesis. I might be wrong, but I do think it's a muted red, black, and green, and of course the black fist also recalls that, and have it here. So gallery by gallery, we're seeing that ever-presence, which you articulated so eloquently. Thank you. I could keep speaking, but I would love to give everyone else an opportunity to ask questions. Okay, there's one here, another here. Okay, maybe we'll start over here, sorry.
Okay, hi, I'm Dominic. I want to first say thank you for the lovely talk from all three of you and all four of you. It's wonderful. Can we actually take the slide back to the Lala image? And so, because I thought that image was quite poignant for the conversation that you guys were having. So, like the history of that red, black, and green flag, the UNIA and Marcus Garvey first came to conceive of it in response to a song, and the song was, I'm pretty sure the song was, "Every race has a flag except for the coon," and so that song in and of itself kind of popularized the idea of the coon being in the American consciousness. So when I think about this particular painting here, you have the La La, which also is a song that runs counter, because that song is from Stevie Wonder's song, "Ma Chérie Amour." This idea of love and this idea that music also echoes out throughout many of Kerry James Marshall's work in conjunction with that same flag. And so I thought like the parallels between the certain songs you see Kerry emphasizing in his music and the kind of cultural landscape of his figures was important. But also for you to go back to that beauty salon painting, which I thought was probably one of my favorites too, is that the flag doesn't manifest as a literal object all the time, because his figures in and of themselves are quite literally painted black. And so, like the ground is red, the walls are green. Of course, you see the reflection of the flag in the background, but you'll see Kerry be kind of cheeky with that because his characters are quite literally black. And so they can operate as that stand-in for the flag as well. And I was curious about that kind of mode of address of the red, black, and green as a governing principle for his paintings and their composition, and how, like the red, white, and blue flag almost never shows up in those paintings whatsoever, right? And you only see that flag in that painting, the 4th of July bang image, right? And I thought that was quite interesting as an omission for it, because then it forces your idea to think about like the context of where those subjects actually live. Is that is that Black America, like Black America? Is that an alternative reality in which Black people after emancipation started their own type of land with their own flag, and this is what's dictating the life nature of those paintings? And so I'm just curious about the kind of thought process around how that color governs, the way he thinks about the world those subjects live in. The music that they use, the colors, the fact these hyper Black bodies are also a part of that flag in and of themselves in their condition. And so I was curious, is there any kind of thought around that?
Well, I just wanted to add to your question that, that of course we have Chris O'Feely's work here and the Tate work. So there's a really kind of, just to add to this complication around where are we, where do we assume we are, right?
But it also could have just been an observation. I was just interested because you guys all said such beautiful things, and I was thinking about there's so many details in that painting in particular that point to just this mode of address of that color.
Thank you. Is anyone else to respond to that? Oh, sorry, there was one. Oh, there's one here. Oh, am I covering? Really? Oh, you got it. Okay, maybe we'll take 3 questions all at once and then...
I just want to respond. I'm really intrigued, and I just really loved the way that Nydia was bringing in this notion of eroticism, because I do think that this is something that actually is something that is there throughout Kerry James Marshall's work. I think the use of hot pink, for example. I was talking to a friend. I was actually talking to Njeka about this because Njeka came and did a talk at Goldsmiths and had this jumpsuit that was part her work and part this kind of Kerry James Marshall hot pink. I'm just wondering if we can talk a little bit more about that, about it in relation to, also I'm just thinking about Lord's notions of the erotic. These erotics that are, like you said, very sort of subtle. And also what you were saying, Nydia, about these being quite everyday, being these very sort of special, intimate moments of tenderness. And that also relationship to Blackness, and also a kind of politic around Blackness.
This person has had their hand up this for a while. Sorry, I just lost
Thank you so much. Yeah, it actually follows on from the point that was just made over there. But I think I really struggle with the works in the red, black, and green room. And maybe you guys could help me kind of understand it. But I guess the act of concealment, and I feel like those works, especially the kind of the nude body, is quite different to the intimate kind of tender gestures that we've seen in the previous rooms, perhaps with the vignette. And I feel like there's a slippage here between something that is kind of a tenderness, but also a sexuality, like the genitals are covered, but yet the stare kind of is almost interrogating you. And I guess this question maybe relates to Nydia, your talk, but perhaps it can extend to the panel. What do you think is going on here with this slippage into a sexualized image and one that is also like politically reinforced, beyond kind of Kerry being a bit of a trickster, and what this might mean for different kinds of audiences encountering his work? Thank you.
Well, maybe we'll pause there so you have time to respond to the 3 questions that have just been asked. So there was one about red, black, and green as a governing principle in his work. The other about the erotic in some of the images in relation to also Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. And the last about the slippage between tenderness and the erotic, and maybe the sexualization of women.
Okay, sure. I can you were right. Yeah, that's fair. I think I'll try to bring the 2 questions together around the erotic and sexuality. Let me be honest and say that when I first saw those images, when I first walked into the room, I think, in fact, the first thing I said to Nikita is, what do I do with these images that have sexualized Black bodies and put Pan-African imagery on it, and how do we feel about it, and how do we interpret it? And because I think, again, I've been invited to think through my own practice, and obviously think through my own practice on Amy Ashwood Garvey in relation to the work. And so, since my work is fundamentally ancestral in the sense that I try to carry with her in any space that I seek to bring her into, I was carrying her and wearing her, if you will. And my feeling was that she would not have seen herself represented there because of, one, the very respectability politics that she sought to unpick within her theatrical productions were also the same respectability politics that framed the way in which she wanted to be seen in the world. And she certainly wouldn't have wanted to be seen as a pinup girl or as naked or as sexual or sexualized. And that's also something that I think about in my writing about her life, in that the truth is that she had a very full sexual life. And there's a lot has been written about her as promiscuous, to be honest. One of the earliest scholars of her life, Toni Martin, ripped her sexual life to shreds in order to affirm Marcus Garvey's justification for leaving her to marry her best friend. So actually the way in which she saw her sexual life was very private. And that's what I was trying to gesture towards without taking too much space and belaboring that point, because I wanted to actually thinking about what Kerry James Marshall might open up for me as well. But I appreciate the question because it gives me the chance to expand on what the point I was trying to gesture towards there, which is that I don't think she might have seen herself in that space for those reasons. But at the same time, I think because she did live a sexual life and lived a life that was formed around sensuality and the erotic and pleasure, and she did that through the intimate relationships she had with her good friends. If you could read some of the letters between her and Claudia Jones, if you could read the letters between her and Lionel Yard, the first biographer of her life, they're beautiful and they're passionate. She calls her friends darling. She tells them she loves them. She calls them beautiful. She says intimate things about herself. She talks about her sexual life. She talks about the rumors about her sexual life. She talks about who she could marry, who she could not. She very much led an erotic life and thought of the erotics as a politics of liberation. So I think then there's a way in which I could potentially weave that into what Kerry James Marshall is trying to gesture when I suggested that he's also trying to think about pleasure as a site of Black knowledge production. I think that's what I was trying to capture there, but I completely feel you. Because but I think I wanted to explore what else it could show us and what other ways to read it. But I think there is definitely a tension there that doesn't sit easy with, I think, the way that any UNIA woman would have wanted to imagine themselves as a part of this movement. And I think it is worth the question, would they see themselves in this imagery? I think it is an important question to ask of the work. And I think it's an invitation then to think about the erotic in a new way, potentially.
I just wanted to kind of throw into our conversation to this kind of idea about, I don't know, this painting especially, like there is something in here, I mean, we can talk about it in relation to Manet, but I think that's quite boring, personally. There are other great, other painters I would love to talk about, but I actually think there's something here that's like quite a queer gesture, like as a method, and I think that touch operates as like kind of a queer methodology in Kerry's work, and I know many people kind of look at the figures that are touching and kind of make assumptions or presumptions around sexuality and say that it's not in the work, but I see it in the work very often, and so I just wanted to kind of like bring that method into our conversation, right? Which is like there's something particularly Black and queer about the way that touch operates, that the nude operates, not the naked, right, as a radical intervention. And that like sensuousness and sensuality can be sexuality, but is often not, right? And this is what I loved about, your work on Amy, is like that intimacy, and Laurent talked about this yesterday, intimacy is not merely organized around the sexual, that it is also about a kind of invitation to care for one another, to like be vulnerable in the face of the violence that surround and precludes us, right? And that I see that in these works, that actually red, black, and green, it's actually that chromatic register that allows for the potential of a radical sensuality, a queer touch, a knowing look that transgresses, I think, the ways that some people, and I say some people very deliberately, might feel uncomfortable looking at this image, while others feel seen, and still others feel like, like they can internalize that and take it with them outside of the gallery.
I don't really have much to add, but I think, I guess bringing together those two, I guess is that translation for me. I think that kind of responds to your question as well about like the governing the colors and as a kind of governing principle is like the translation of like the everyday. At the end of the day, intimacy, sexuality, these things are part of everyday life, and what your work has been showing us is that as much as these people are political activists, and when it comes to that kind of, I guess that bringing together of the Black feminist methodologies of like, the pleasure and the politics of pleasure, but then also what do these things translating, like how do they land in the everyday, and how do we make sure that whether it's a drawing that's on a bedroom, that's a very kind of cheeky gesture towards bringing together these two worlds that don't neatly fit together. I think it's actually an important conversation to have, to not isolate these two things, these three things as distinct, but actually part of the work of what Black knowledge production looks like in the everyday. And I think that's where the possibility kind of lies.
Yeah, I think you saying that also makes me think that throughout your presentations, there's a notion of Black interiority. I think Kevin Young spoke about Elizabeth Alexander yesterday in her poetry, but in her work, she's thinking through this idea of Black interiority, not just in terms of our literal domestic spaces, but the inner worlds that we inhabit and how we might show up in our own homes when no one else is seeing, with like naked and with socks on, but still with a consciousness of Black nationalism. And I think it's really interesting thinking about the great conversations that took place yesterday about invisibility and visibility, what we allow for, in terms of what we allow others to see, and it matters who is seeing that, and how that changes whether we think that an image like this is sexualized or whether it's someone in possession of their own sexual agency, I guess. One of the other questions. Hi.
Okay, I'm sitting here sometimes when we have conversations around something that might be someone's everyday experience, it becomes a bit challenging. So when I walked into the room, and some of it is age, I'm seeing an Ohio Players album cover from the 70s, or when we lived in Northern California, you'd go into an art store in Oakland and you would see these images. So I'm just wondering, because of Kerry James Marshall's proximity to the Black arts movement, is it possible that in 2012, he's like, I've always wanted to paint something similar to the 70s. Could it be something that's simple, and do we overly intellectualize someone's direct experience? That was not my original question. And it wasn't a question, it was just an observation, because when I saw the images, all I saw was every Black male household, every household that had a Black male, they had images of Black women. And if you're not familiar with the Black arts movement, the Black is Beautiful movement in the United States. So that is what this reminded me of. But my question was about the use of the word feminism versus womanism in, in describing, womanism, and I'm thinking of bell hooks, and we as Black women separating ourselves from white women in the United States in the use of the term feminism, because of all the work that you described that Garvey did. And that was where we separated from white women with regards to the terminology, in terms of our focus on our community, and that we couldn't necessarily separate ourselves from our male children and our male family members. And so I'm wondering, do you use the term feminism because of the Academy, or do you not have an opinion about that? But I felt that everything you were describing about her would have been a womanist perspective as opposed to a feminist perspective.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was dreaming, and I felt someone, and that was Audre Lorde. And what has Audre Lorde can say to what we are discussing about today? Are you familiar with Audre Lorde? So I would like you to tell me why somehow she came to me. So that's all. Thank you.
Do you want to take one more? Yeah. And this one, another guy.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question about flags and how right now, if you step out of, or if you go outside in society, there are a lot of England flags, and how every time I see that, I feel this anticipation of dread, but at the same time, there is this increasing representation of people of color and of immigrants and of people from the diaspora in institutions like the RA. And I guess I just have very conflicting emotions all the time, kind of this great joy of being in this room, but then when you go outside, kind of that dread you see of the flag and the representation of the flag. So I guess the question is, how do you as cultural historians kind of think of this deep confliction that we feel in our society at the moment, perhaps in the context of viewing Kerry James Marshall's work today?
Would it help to go over the questions, or should I?
I'll start back. Flags are, where I live, unfortunately, in this time period, we are coming up on the 250th anniversary, and the flag is a big thing. The U.S. American flag is like a big thing that we've had to kind of wrestle with as people who refuse the flag, contest it, its meaning. So in my context, it's very like in my face right now. I want to say that I think that in terms of a deep conflict, like what I find to be very compelling and I think moving about Marshall's work is this deep reverence and irreverence of the flag, right? Doing even the kind of Pan-African flag, right? Even the UNIA flag, like this painting that we're all looking at, right? This thing that, like, you take this symbol that is supposed to be installed in a very specific way, right? Often in ways that force us in our bodies to tilt our head up in reverence to look at it, right? It's an ideological training that happens at the level of our bodies. And he puts it as a wallpaper in the beauty shop, as a flag that kind of is draped and touching his body, as a fingernail color, right? It's something that is like incorporated and kind of troubled. It's even this flag that we have so much reverence for is kind of he inverts the logic to say that we have to use it. It has to touch our bodies. The figures in the painting have to be the black that make the red and the green visible. And so by that kind of incorporation, I think it is a skill and strategy of a Black radical tradition to do something else with it. Even in the Lala painting, I thought of you immediately, Aleema, about the gold birds that I just hadn't noticed that fleck the sky and punctuate the red and green and black. So there are ways that I think he moves us out of that kind of grid, right? Out of that logic of reverence or patriotism or nationalism, jingoism, the deep violence of that as an ideology, and deconstructs the flag, destroys it sometimes, decentralizes it to make it atmospheric and make it live like sensorially on our corpus, on our bodies. I think that to me is like the power of where red, black, and green appears in the work.
I suppose I'll answer the question on my use of feminism. I would say I probably do it for two reasons. The first being because Amy Ashwood Garvey called herself a feminist, which I think, fair enough. I feel like I can pick that up and use that as a way of narrating and thinking about her life. But I also think, to answer your question about womanism, I do think maybe where we diverge on the thinking around it is my understanding of the kind of articulation of womanism as a feminist project, or as a particular project, was not so much to say that feminism has no meaning or no value to Black women, but rather to kind of map out a particular genealogy of a Black feminist practice that is rooted in community, in the shared struggle with Black men and other people of color, that is rooted in class. It is an earliest articulation of what we think of now as intersectionality. That's how I think of womanism. And so I don't think that even Alice Walker or anyone who was the earliest proponents of womanism would say that it's not synonymous, you can't say Black feminism. In fact, I always forget the quote, but it's like, womanism to lavender womanism is to purple as lavender. Oh.
As violet.
Yeah, as violet, yeah. I mean, she sort of makes this comparison of them as different shades of the same color. So I actually, which I think is interesting for thinking about color here today, actually. So I think for me, I could easily use womanism, but I think I've used it in part because that's also the kind of critical, theoretical frame through which I have come to understand and interpret Amy Ashwood Garvey's life, but also, as I said, because she called herself that, yeah, so.
I think, I guess what both the questions are kind of speaking to is this politics of representation and the struggle around that. I always reference a quote by Bell Hooks where she's talking about this field of representational struggle, of like how we see ourselves and how others sees us is a field of representational struggle, particularly for those of us within the African and Caribbean diaspora. And I think language becomes a part of that, that toolkit, whether you're referencing womanism, feminism, within Rastafari, we might say sistering, is what we do with it. And I think similar to the flag, the conversations around the flag, there's a strong, something that I didn't really touch upon within the presentation because I didn't want to divulge within spaces of like the critique around Garveyism and fascism and all of those things around that kind of politics of what does it mean to engage with these kind of contemporary questions that we should ask ourselves as Black people, this Black imperialist project, right? And what does that kind of offer us? But I think for me is what I think is important between both of these conversations is really the tools and the toolkits of like how will we make meaning and how are we making it useful for the everyday lives that we're living and practicing. once again, I think that's where the possibility is.
We still have quite a bit of time. Oh, there was the question about Audre Lorde. Sorry. Oh, no. Yeah.
Yes. I suppose I could, obviously, I think I can see why you would say that, of course. I'm thinking about Audre Lorde and the uses of erotic. So yes, she was definitely there as I was thinking about how she might be able to come to a relation with those particular paintings. But I think it's also interesting when we think about Audre Lorde and the idea of like automythography and thinking about like kind of writing and imagining the self and the different kind of like myths that we might pull together to articulate a kind of a narrative of the self or an autobiography of the self, and how the erotic is one part of the thing she explores in Zami, A True Telling of My Name, but of course she also explores culture and music and relation and all these different things. So I think why I didn't necessarily like cite Audre Lorde and her thinking in my writing around Amy Ashford Garvey, I think her work and her writing about herself is always present in my thinking around Black women's writing and Black women's poetry and Black women's storytelling and the kind of personal and how we express our interior world and the political power of doing that, whether we are on picket lines or whether we are just taking care of our children. And so I think that's something that's one of the kind of tools that I think Audre Lorde's life and work and poetry gives us in thinking about life more broadly. And so yes, it's always there for me.
And I think there's also the quote that slipped to my mind now, the master's tools. Yeah, and I think that's an important conversation that kind of feeds on some of the conversations that was happening yesterday with like the role of institutions, the role of, knowledge production. And I think sometimes I have a complicated relationship with museums, as much as I do a lot of work within museums and the heritage institutions. As I always feel like museum, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about for the last couple of years is that museum is a place where history dies. So how can we bring it to life? How can we activate it and liberate it? And I think when I think about, of course, Audre Lorde, I'm thinking about the master's tools and the how Babylon always seems to reinvent itself, even when we're pushing back against it. And I think for me, it's an ongoing reminder to like, even though sometimes there's a limit to good intentions, and to be critical of our own practices, and also always renegotiating, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What is the question here? Who is it for? And I think that kind of speaks to this element of responsibility, which we all have, that sense of responsibility as people working, memory workers, I suppose, working through memory in multiple different ways. And I think that kind of methodological framing is an important endeavor for us all to kind of engage with.
Thank you very much. My name is Ezra. I just wanted to say it's like incredibly illuminating, very compelling discussion. My question kind of came to mind during Aleema's presentation when you mentioned the idea of imagination, because it reminded me of something that a friend said to me, that we are all living in someone's imagination, which made me think, like, whose imagination are we living in? And like coming in today, I saw like the monuments to, or the statues of like, I think it's Adam Smith and John Locke, men whose imaginations have kind of set the precedent for like the way we kind of navigate the world today. So my question, especially in the context of this work, is like, how do artists challenge those imaginations and create new imaginations that can kind of compel us to move forward in a different way than what we've been presented with? And also like, what's the step from like imagination and like that prompt to reality, and actually like living in those new ways and those new like perspectives on the world, and who's doing that today that we can reference? Thank you.
There was one, the one here.
Thank you. I was thinking about yesterday's conversation about the Western canon and its influence, and thinking about flags. I noticed in the painting Keeping the Culture what looked like it could be an Asafo flag, and how that flag might be an opportunity to think about reading fabric as archive, as a formal language of minimal colour fields, and also a product of community creation, as an influence on Marshall's practice.
You know, this is more of a comment than a question. I should be the last person doing this, actually. But in terms of Aleema, what you were saying about what then do you do with it, right? So we think of Haile Selassie and the creation of a new nation state, but then after that, the flag exists as a symbol of what should be coming from the people. But in terms of visual art, I think, Sam, you know, when you said in terms of the black mass could be seen or lost given one's perspective on the painting, but in everything, once you leave that idea or once you leave the paint, what then do you do with your understanding from this very conversation after you leave? Mm-hmm. What then do you do with the new nation state? What then do you do? Is this generative? Well, maybe it's only generative if in fact you for yourself can construct something from what you heard. As with La 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 La, Stevie Wonder, it's easier in music and we fall in love. But in terms of visual art, how then do we do that? Leave here with something that we can construct for our lives moving forward.
Wait, should we start? I just want to. I am not as brilliant as my colleagues here in terms of both their knowledge of social, cultural, and political history, but also their activation of it. So I wanted to kind of take Laurent's invitation and just focus on the micro. I teach university. I teach a lot of 18, 19-year-olds who have never seen anybody that looks like me in front of them as an arbiter of knowledge or a kind of person who knows art and its histories. And they definitely have never seen anything that looks like this. And I've spent a lot of my time teaching artists specifically, which is the biggest gift I've had in my life, working with young artists, because they are attuned to the politics of looking. And I think, you know, for me, looking holds such a weighted history in Black life, specifically because in the States especially, the history of surveillance and policing, the ways that even just being seen in public from the 19th century to the 21st is some kind of admission of criminality or loitering, or, you know, you're constantly under the legacies of the Fugitive Slave Act there in terms of just being out in the world. And so for me, like, the biggest gesture is the smallest in terms of what we do, which is if I can just pivot the line a little bit to demonstrate the ways that Black artists especially train us to see differently, and that the canvas becomes a mode of instruction, right? Or the gallery becomes a place where we can spend more than 8 seconds, I think Kimberly said, right, in front of a work, that we can take the lesson of like, okay, looking is actually an embodied practice, and then you internalize that thing and you go out into the world. And how do you take that responsibility of learning to see differently, right? Learning to see, in this case, Black life as something other than the way that we've been trained to see it through a white gaze, through white institutions and white supremacy, then that might do something that moves the needle, right? And so it's not a big political gesture, you know. I hope that slides into a whole other set of things, but I'm kind of interested in sparking that dynamic so that those relational moments can create bigger pathways. And to me, it starts like really, like quite literally in how we adjust our eyes, how we like move our faces and our bodies in relation to one another.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that idea of like the relational moments and try to think about my own relationship to being a museum worker and the role of the imagination in it. I would say, you know, after, what is it, like 6 or 7 years working in the glam sector in London, I'm like pretty jaded by it in some ways, and that I don't necessarily think that my presence there or my work there is fundamentally going to radically transform the institution. I just don't think that anymore. But I do think that my presence, however temporary, might facilitate moments and opportunities for people to imagine themselves in the histories contained within it. And I just think about, like, that's the goal of my work. So yeah, rather than, like, I spend a lot less time trying to challenge the institution, I think, because I also think, oh, the master's tools. Like, I think instead, I try to think about, like, how do I create those, like, relational moments? And I want to mention, like, one recently from my work at RMG and one that I actually had with Nikita here. First, I would say that, like, at the museum I work with at Royal Museums Greenwich, there are multiple kinds of public programs like International Slave Remembrance Day, Caribbean Takeover, Windrush Day, that are specifically spaces for Black and African descended people and their allies and communities to take up space. And it is always a challenge to get those things promoted. It's always a challenge to get those things off the ground. It's supported to make them happen at an institutional level. There's value in it, let's do it, we've got to do it. But to get it promoted is like, wow. You rarely see it on the places, social media. And I'm working there and I'm saying this publicly. And I find that very challenging and very frustrating. But then I have moments where the actual event happens and somehow 1,000 people from descended from the Caribbean managed to come to Caribbean Takeover, even though in the weeks prior we're like, these people don't post it, why not? And we're all like working ourselves up in attention. Somehow they come and they're there. And I have this beautiful moment where, like, soca is blaring through the museum. And me and a colleague walk up the stairs and it's children dancing around with their, like, the carnival wings and everything. And it's like, yeah, okay. So all of that is this. I actually don't need the institution to say it's happening, because we say it's happening. And it happened, didn't it? And we imagined it could happen, and how we imagined it could be is happening, didn't it? And so that's what I tend to focus on. And then I think as well, I've been thinking a lot about, like, what it means for Kerry's work to be staged here. And I was thinking about it yesterday because a point was made a couple of times about, like, it could only be possible to be staged here and not the United States. And I don't want to speak for too long. I think we could complicate that, actually. But I don't want to go on too much on that, other than to just say that what I was struck by when I came to, I was like, oh, what does it mean to show it at the RA? What does it mean to show it at this institution, and why? And I was excited to, like, come and see it here and see what that means as someone who doesn't always come up here to see the space, because I can't really afford it. But I came and really excited by the invitation to be here and the opportunity to see the work and to be in a dialogue with you. And I came during the half term, which is a time when school children and are, like, up to sixth form are out of school. So the space was, like, lively. It was hyped. It was full, and it was full of, like, adults who are their children, looking for activities, cultural activities to keep them occupied during the half term. It was like sixth formers, people who look like sixth formers walking around with open notebooks in groups and pairs having conversations about the work. And Nikita and I had this moment where we were talking and we're, like, moving around, and you were saying, it's so lively today, it's, like, so energetic, and we're talking about how awesome that feels to be here on that particular day. And we were talking about the work, and this woman and her daughter came up to us and asked if they could join our tour and listen to us and listen to Nikita. So we spent this moment there together, us, like, 3 Black women and 1 Black child, in this relational moment around Kerry James Marshall's work, and I thought, this is the counter archive. It's this space, it's this moment, it's a moment of connection, particularly when her mother asked, do you work here? And you were like, oh yeah, I'm a part of the curatorial team that helped to, like, create this space. I'm a team of people. And to see that child see herself, see that Black curator, see that space, that's the relational moment. So that's why I do it. So I think that's the moment of the imagination. That's the moment where, like, the tools that we use might disrupt the master's space in which they imagine us and the ways in which we have to force ourselves in. So, like, yeah, will work make a radical transformation at the RA? I'm not sure I'm invested in that. I think what is it created in right now that we're here? I think that's what I feel is significant.
I'm trying to think what I could say, because I have so many things to say that kind of echo a lot of the things that both of you are saying. But specifically to the, like, what do you want history to do for us, and the question that you're kind of putting forward, I always situate myself back within a framework within Rastafari that we have I and I. And when we say I and I, we're really dealing with the I in relation to a collective we. And so everywhere that I go, I think about that. And I think it's something that academics, people working within certain isms and schisms really struggle to situate their own positionality and their own lived realm within their work. We're very much removed from what does it mean for someone from a particular lived experience to be curating a particular lived experience. So I think about the I and I a lot, and then I think about responsibility a lot and what we can do. And I very much sometimes have a very complicated relationship with the word activist and how the ways in which blackness can only, it seems, show up in these institutions as opposition to something, you know, as this kind of disruptor, as this kind of contested thing. Sometimes we don't want to be contested, you know, sometimes we just want to understand the intimacies, the softness of it. But when we show up in these Babylonian institutions, quite often we have to be this hard thing, you know? And it becomes a very strange, complicated field as curators to kind of navigate. I'm thinking about, I curated Beyond the Baseline at the British Library, 500 Years of Black British Music. And that was a whole entanglement of complicated histories and expectations of what it means to put forward a Black British experience, 500 years of that, in a space like British Library, you know? But then I think about the fact that one of the things that you're speaking to as well, Nydia, is access, you know? I'm in a privileged position, as much as the starting point of my position is very much from the community space. So I didn't go to museums growing up. My place was very much supplementary school and the Nyabingi and, you know, other spaces that Black people have gathered, similar to, you know, the jazz club, the underground concert and all of those things. That was my starting point. But at the same time, here I am. And therefore, when I think about Walter Rodney, the redistributive politics of like knowledge productions, Medea. So what is my responsibility now? Is to liberate the archive. And I think for me, particularly as someone that's coming from a trajectory that has displaced materials, there is something incredibly important in working with materials that are literally in the dungeons and blowing the dust off of them and kind of bringing them out into the public. And so when I'm, you know, curating Beyond the Baseline, when I'm, you know, in these institutions, I think the tool is the invitation of the conversation that we're inviting for people to be curious, to think differently, to use the material conditions to make meaning for the everyday. And I see my responsibility as someone who is kind of a guerrilla warfare almost curator of like, all right, let's take this, let's liberate this, and let's make sure the conversation that I'm having is always with the people that is not necessarily within these kind of spaces. And it's not easy, you know, but I think this is where the imagination lies, you know, when we're trying to kind of speak to that conversation about imagination.
We have 9 minutes. Okay. Are there any other questions other than? Okay.
I do have a question, and I wanted to also comment to something a young lady said over here when she talked about the tension that she's wrestling with, being in this space and how it makes you feel, and then going outside of the space and seeing all of the British flags and how you're wrestling with that tension. And what that means. And I just wanted to comment that I'm from New York, I live in the United States, and talk a little bit about flags. So in the United States, we have a different kind of what we call football, right? It's not soccer, it's the United States football. And to celebrate football, we have something that's called the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl is where the national identity kind of performs its myth around American patriotism and unity and spectacle and power. And if you ever get a chance to, I encourage you to go to YouTube and look at the halftime performance of this year's Super Bowl and watch Kendrick Lamar show up and show out. Because what Kendrick Lamar did to that American flag, you have to witness it. He draped himself and he re-choreographed the American flag. And you said it. When you talk about artists help us see things differently, they train us to see things differently. Kendrick forced us, 100 million people from around the world forced us into like this profound discomfort with the American flag. And he kept prodding as those black dancers choreographed around the stage and kept asking, whose America is this? Who pays the cost of the red, the white, and the blue? And he makes the familiar of turning the flag into something that where patriotism is fractured. And so Kerry James Marshall, in my opinion, does something parallel with the Pan-African flag. Not simply using it as color, but transforming it into a whole system of memory and sovereignty and belonging. So for me, when I walked in the room, I thought to myself, if the American flag is the question, the Pan-African flag is the answer. For me. So my question is what do you think black artists are ultimately asking us to confront? And what new ways of seeing are they insisting that we learn?
I think there was one more. Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe we'll close on that question. Or is there another? There was a question there. But, no. Okay. Yeah.
This is a great question. Also because people it was interesting to see who hated the Kendrick performance, which they told on themselves, you know? I think that one of the kinds of challenges that are posed, and this is actually a conversation I was having earlier, like Kerry James Marshall is like technique times a million, and also cannot paint a white person. Like, or refuses to paint a white person. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyway, I find it and I think like, so anyway, this I will get to the answer to the question, which is I think, again, like, there's a way that artists have over centuries, and we talked about it a lot yesterday, trained us to see whiteness as a particular, like with depth, with beauty, with charm, with charge, with all of these kind of luminosity, all this luminosity. And I just love that we might leave Marshall's exhibition here and think two things. One, right, think about the complexities of Black life and understanding Black interiority and beauty and history, but also that we might walk away with a disregard for whiteness.
Do you want to respond to that?
I feel like I was going to say exactly that. I think I was going to say exactly the same thing, but adding to that, I think there's also the emotion and the affect, right? And I think that's such an important thing, not even just like the visual artist, but I think a lot of the conversations that we've had is also speaking to that kind of sonic element as well that emerges when we bear witness to some of these paintings. And I think the opportunity there is to take us on that journey, that emotional journey quite often, the imagined, the lived, the affect. And I think for me, when I think about museum as this place where history dies, the artist is offering us a way for it to live. And I think this is the role. So even my own practice, I see myself as a historian, but the practice of my work doing a historian, I think there's an opportunity there for us who are not artists to think about what it would mean to also work, see history as this kind of creative practice. And I think this is what, Kerry James Marshall work also offers us, as well as the disregard of whiteness, as well as the burning of Babylon. But yeah, thank you.
But I think the other very important factor is the St. George doesn't only belong to the fascists. We should claim it, and then it will be deleted in its meaning to leave us and it belongs them. No, it is ours. We claim it. What can they do? They have to reinvent another flag. We shouldn't be frightened. Sorry.
Now, did you want to say more? Okay, we're at time. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's